The frantic dash from the altar. It focuses on the physicality of the escape, the weight of the heavy dress, the burning in her lungs, and the sheer desperation of diving into a parked car. It establishes that for Naomi, returning to Arthur is a fate worse than death. Frantic and breathless during the run, followed by a sudden, deafening silence the moment the car door clicks shut. This shift from chaos to a controlled, simmering crawl inside the luxury vehicle builds massive suspense. High-stakes K-drama noir. It feels expensive, cold, and dangerous, balancing the elegance of a wedding with the grit of the underworld. Total anonymity. She wants to disappear from the world of high society expectations and Arthur's surveillance. Because Arthur has controlled her for so long, she initially mistakes Ji-hoon's commanding presence for another form of abuse. Her arc is about learning the difference between being controlled and being cherished. Arthur, the narcissistic groom. He represents weaponized status, using his family name and money to treat people like property. If she is caught, she doesn't just lose her freedom. Arthur will ensure she is socially and psychologically erased, locked away in a gilded cage forever. The moment Naomi screams, "Just drive," and catches Ji-hoon's cold, tattooed gaze in the rearview mirror, the realization that she isn't in a taxi. The drive to the estate, the tension of Ji-hoon offering her a glass of water, a simple act of care that Naomi finds terrifying because she doesn't know the price. Arthur tracks the car and arrives with a legal team and security, arrogance on full display. He is met by the absolute, silent authority of Ji-hoon's syndicate. Arthur realizes his wealth is nothing compared to Ji-hoon's power. Naomi removes her wedding ring and leaves it on the table. She chooses to step out of the light of a false marriage and into the protected shadows of the Korean Mafia. The heavy door of the black sedan clicked shut, sealing out the frantic screams of the wedding guests and the distant, rhythmic thud of Arthur's footsteps on the gravel. For a heartbeat, the interior was a vacuum of silence, smelling of expensive leather and a faint, sharp scent of sandalwood. "Drive," Naomi wheezed, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She pressed her forehead against the cool, tinted glass of the window, her breath fogging the surface in erratic bursts. "Please, just drive, anywhere but here." She didn't look at the driver. She couldn't. Her entire world was reduced to the pulsing bruise on her cheek and the way her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate to break free. She waited for the engine to roar, for the tires to screech, for the frantic getaway she'd seen in 100 movies. Instead, there was only the soft, mechanical hum of a high-performance engine turning over, smooth, effortless, and terrifyingly calm. The car glided forward. It didn't race. It surged with a predatory grace that made Naomi's skin crawl. As the lights of the church estate faded into a blur of amber and white in the distance, the adrenaline that had carried her through the courtyard began to drain, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. She shifted slightly, the silk of her ruined gown rustling loudly in the quiet cabin. That was when she saw him in the rearview mirror. Her breath hitched. She had expected a frantic taxi driver, perhaps an older man confused by the bleeding bride in his back seat. But the eyes meeting hers in the glass were dark, steady, and devoid of fear. They weren't the eyes of a man who was afraid of the police or the wealthy man screaming in the rear view. They were the eyes of a man who owned the road he drove on. As the car passed beneath a flickering street lamp, light flooded the cabin for a fraction of a second. Naomi's gaze dropped from his eyes to his neck. Creeping up from beneath the pristine white collar of a tailored dress shirt was the dark, intricate ink of a tattoo, the scales of a dragon, or perhaps the coils of a serpent winding toward his jawline. It was a mark of belonging, a brand of power that whispered of a world far more dangerous than the one she had just escaped. Her eyes drifted lower, taking in the breadth of his shoulders beneath a charcoal suit jacket that cost more than her wedding veil. His hands rested on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, large, steady, and also covered in ink that disappeared into his cuffs. There was no meter on the dashboard, no taxi medallion, no radio chatter. "You're not a taxi," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. "The doors are locked, Naomi," the driver said. His voice was a rich, low baritone, flavored with a subtle Korean accent that felt like velvet over steel. The sound of her name sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't said a word except for drive. "How do you—" "You are a loud man, Arthur," Ji-hoon interrupted, his gaze never leaving the road ahead. He adjusted the mirror slightly, his movements precise and controlled. "He makes it very easy to know who he is and who he thinks he owns." He slowed the car as they reached a quiet intersection, the turn signal ticking like a countdown. Naomi felt the walls of the car closing in. She had jumped from the fire, but as she looked at the stoic, tattooed man at the wheel, she realized she had landed in something much deeper and much darker. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Ji-hoon turned the wheel, his movements fluid. "The only reason you're still breathing," he replied simply. "Now sit back. We have a long drive ahead." The car glided past the final cluster of neon-drenched high-rises, the shimmering lights of the city falling away like a discarded memory. As the asphalt stretched into the desolate, unlit highway that marked the city limits, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The hum of the tires changed from a city growl to a smooth, hypnotic purr, and the silence between Naomi and the man at the wheel grew heavy, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Naomi gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white against the dark leather. She watched the speedometer needle climb steadily, yet she felt no vibration, no shudder of the frame. It was a machine built for ghosts and kings, silent, invisible, and absolute. She looked out the window at the passing trees, now nothing more than skeletal shadows against the midnight sky. She was officially beyond the reach of the world she knew. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft climate control. The driver didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the tilt of the steering wheel with a flick of his tattooed wrist, his profile etched in the dim glow of the dashboard like a statue of obsidian. When he finally spoke, the sound didn't just fill the car, it seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Naomi's bones. "You asked to go anywhere but there," Ji-hoon said. His voice was a cold baritone rasp, devoid of the frantic energy that had defined Naomi's entire life with Arthur. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise it to be obeyed. "I am simply granting a lady's wish." "I thought you were a taxi," she said, her chest tightening as she stared at the back of his head. "I didn't realize. I didn't see the car clearly." "A common mistake," he replied, and for the first time a ghost of a shadow, not quite a smile but something sharper, flickered in his expression in the mirror in the dim glow of the dashboard, like a statue of obsidian. When he finally spoke, the sound didn't just fill the car, it seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Naomi's bones. "You are Korean," she noted, her mind racing to connect the tattoos, the luxury, and the chilling authority in his tone. "The markings on your neck, I've seen them in stories, in news reports." Ji-hoon didn't flinch. "Stories are often written by those who are afraid. I prefer to write my own." He brought the car to a halt before a massive steel gate that slid open without a sound. Naomi felt a wave of nausea. She had traded a domestic prison for an International Fortress. She looked at the door handle again, but her hand stayed frozen. The man in the front seat was a stranger, a criminal by all appearances, yet there was a strange, terrifying stability in him that Arthur lacked. Arthur was a storm of glass and rage. This man was the deep, silent ocean. "My name is Ji-hoon," he said, turning the engine off. The sudden silence was deafening. "And from this moment on, your life as Arthur's property has ended. Whether that is a blessing or a curse depends entirely on how well you listen." The car glided through a second set of gates, the gravel crunching under the wheels like breaking bone, before coming to a final, elegant halt. Naomi peered through the window at the structure before them. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress of glass and steel, an ultra-modern monolith carved into the side of a wooded hill. Sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows glowed with a soft, recessed light that felt more like a museum than a home. Ji-hoon stepped out, his presence immediately commanding the silent air of the courtyard. He didn't wait for her, nor did he offer a hand. He simply walked toward the massive, pivoting front door, his stride steady and rhythmic. Naomi hesitated, her hand trembling as she unlatched the door of the sedan. When her feet hit the pavement, the night air rushed in, cold and biting, reminding her of the thinness of her lace and the vulnerability of her skin. Inside, the estate was a study in minimalist luxury. Polished marble floors reflected the dim ceiling lights like a dark lake. The air was filtered, sterile, and still. Every step Naomi took in her broken heels echoed against the high ceilings, a jarring reminder of the chaos she had brought into this cathedral of order. She felt like a stain on the perfection of the room, a ghost in a ruined wedding dress, trailing the scent of fear and stale perfume. Ji-hoon stopped in a vast living area, where the furniture was low and dark, overlooking the sprawling valley below. He turned, his silhouette framed by the glass, the ink on his neck catching the low light. He didn't look at her with pity. His gaze was clinical, assessing the damage Arthur had done, as if calculating a debt. "The stairs to the left will take you to a suite. There is a bathroom. Clean yourself. Remove that costume." Naomi looked down at her dress. The white lace was shredded at the hem, stained with dirt from her flight, and a small, dark smear of blood on the bodice that wasn't hers. It felt like a heavy, suffocating weight, a skin she was desperate to shed. Following his silent instruction, she ascended the stairs. In the suite, she found a bathroom larger than her entire apartment had been before she met Arthur. Waiting on the edge of the oversized stone tub was a folded garment. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It was silk, a deep, midnight blue that felt like liquid against her battered skin. She stripped away the wedding gown, the fabric falling in a heap of useless finery on the cold floor. As she stepped into the shower, the hot water washed away the grime of the escape, but it couldn't touch the hollow ache in her chest. When she finally stepped out, she wrapped herself in the silk robe. It was heavy and smooth, its coolness soothing the heat of her bruises. For the first time in years, she wasn't wearing something Arthur had chosen for her. But as she tied the belt, she looked at her reflection in the steam-fogged mirror and wondered if she had simply traded a white cage for a blue one. Below, she could hear the faint, muffled sound of a phone ringing. The world was still hunting her, but for now, she was wrapped in the scent of sandalwood and the terrifyingly silent protection of a man the world feared. When Naomi descended the stairs, the heavy midnight blue silk of the robe whispered against the marble, a stark contrast to the frantic rustle of the lace she had left behind. She found Ji-hoon in the same spot, standing before the glass wall that overlooked the darkened valley. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp, dark lines of the tattoos that climbed his neck like rising smoke. He didn't turn immediately. He seemed to be contemplating the lights of the city far below, the world he controlled yet stood apart from. When he finally shifted his gaze to her, it was slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her with the hungry, possessive eyes of Arthur. Instead, his gaze was clinical, resting for a heartbeat on the darkening bruise on her cheek and the way she held her arm tucked slightly against her ribs. On the low obsidian table between them sat a single, heavy glass of water. Small beads of condensation clung to the sides, catching the dim light. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the weight of the word left no room for hesitation. Naomi sank into the deep, dark leather of the sofa, feeling small and fragile against the vastness of the room. Ji-hoon moved with a predator's grace, reaching down to pick up the glass. He didn't hand it to her. He set it down on the edge of the table closest to her, sliding it forward until it was within reach. "Drink," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Your body is in shock. It needs clarity." Naomi reached out, her fingers still trembling as they curled around the cold glass. The water was crisp and sharp, cutting through the copper taste of fear that had lined her throat since the altar. As she drank, she felt his eyes on her, not judging, but measuring. "Arthur will be looking for me," she whispered, setting the glass back down. "He has money. He has people who owe him. He thinks I belong to him." Ji-hoon leaned back against the glass railing, crossing his arms. The movement made the ink on his forearms shift, the dragon scales appearing to writhe beneath his skin. "Arthur is a man who buys loyalty with paper. I command it with blood. There is a difference." He stepped closer, the shadow of his frame falling over her. Naomi flinched instinctively, a reflex born of years of being the target of a man's proximity. Ji-hoon stopped, his expression remaining as cold and unreadable as stone. "Listen to me carefully, Naomi," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. "In the world you just left, you were a wife, a title used to justify your disappearance. In my house, that title does not exist." He leaned down slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "In this house, you are a guest, and I protect my guests with the same absolute violence I use against my enemies. Arthur can scream at the gates all he likes, but he will find that the law of the husband ends where the law of the dragon begins." He stood straight again, his shadow receding. "Sleep now. Tomorrow we begin the process of making sure he never touches you again." In the sterile, white mid-halls of the bridal suite back at the estate, Arthur stared at the empty space where his wife had been. His tuxedo was impeccable, but his face was a mask of twitching, narcissistic fury. To Arthur, Naomi was not a person, she was a high-valued asset that had malfunctioned and fled. He didn't feel heartbreak, he felt the sting of a public humiliation that tasted like ash. "Find the car," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a quiet, lethal edge. He turned to his head of security, a man whose salary was high enough to ignore the law. "It was a black sedan. I want the license plate, I want the driver's name. I want him broken, and I want her back in this house before dawn." By midnight, Arthur had bypassed the local authorities, moving instead through the dark channels of the private sector. He sat in his study, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting in his cold eyes. He authorized a wire transfer, a sum of money that could buy a small island, and placed a bounty on the man who had kidnapped his bride. He believed that money was the ultimate predator, capable of devouring anyone who stood in the way of his desires. He imagined the driver cowering in some slum, terrified by the weight of the wealth being leveled against him. But Arthur was a man who played with fire while standing in a room full of gasoline. He didn't realize that his bounty hadn't just reached the ears of mercenaries, it had hit the servers of the Korean underground. In a windowless room across the city, a burner phone buzzed against a steel table. A man with ink-stained fingers looked at the alert, a bounty for Ji-hoon. He didn't reach for his gun to claim the prize. He laughed. The sound was dry and mirthless. To the underworld, Ji-hoon wasn't a driver to be hunted. He was the head of the dragon. By putting a price on Ji-hoon's head, Arthur hadn't started a search. He had unknowingly signed a declaration of war against an empire that didn't care about his bank balance. Arthur poured himself a drink, staring out at the skyline, convinced he was the most powerful man in the city. He felt the thrill of the hunt, unaware that he was the one who had just walked into the center of a trap. He had spent his life believing that everyone had a price, but he was about to learn that some men were paid in a currency he couldn't afford, absolute, blood-bound loyalty. The shadow he had cast was long, but it was nothing compared to the darkness that was currently rising to meet him. The morning sun didn't rise over the estate so much as it carved its way through the mist, turning the glass walls into sheets of blinding silver. Naomi stood at the top of the grand staircase, her fingers buried in the deep blue silk of her robe. The silence of the night had been replaced by a low, rhythmic hum, the sound of a machine coming to life. She looked down into the expansive marble foyer and froze. Ji-hoon was standing by the massive front doors, silhouetted against the morning glare. He was dressed in another impeccable black suit, his spine straight, his hands clasped behind his back. But it wasn't his presence that stopped her breath, it was the dozen men gathered before him. They were all dressed in variations of charcoal and black, standing in two perfect, disciplined rows. As Ji-hoon took a single step forward, the men moved as one. They didn't just nod, they bent at the waist in a deep, synchronized bow, their voices rising in a sharp, collective greeting that echoed like a thunderclap against the high ceilings. It was a display of absolute, terrifying loyalty, a ritual of respect that looked more like a military formation than a business meeting. Naomi felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Arthur had bodyguards, men he paid to stand in corners and look intimidating. But those men were mercenaries. They looked at Arthur's bank account, not his face. The men in this room looked at Ji-hoon as if he were the center of the world. They didn't look like they were following a paycheck. They looked like they were following a god. Ji-hoon raised a hand, a small, subtle movement, and the men straightened instantly. He began to speak in rapid, low-toned Korean. His voice wasn't raised, but even from the top of the stairs, Naomi could feel the vibration of his authority. One of the men stepped forward, presenting a tablet with a gloved hand. Ji-hoon glanced at it, his jaw tightening, and Naomi knew instinctively that they were discussing the shadow Arthur had cast, the bounty that was currently moving through the city's veins. As the meeting dispersed and the men vanished into the shadows of the estate with silent efficiency, Ji-hoon turned. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Naomi's. The morning light caught the dragon scales on his neck, making the ink look as though it were glowing. Naomi felt the weight of her choice settle in her stomach like lead. She had spent years running from Arthur, a man she called a monster because he used his fists and his screams to break her. But as she watched Ji-hoon standing amongst his soldiers, she realized she had miscalculated the scale of the world. Arthur was a wolf, petty, hungry, and loud. Ji-hoon was something else entirely. He was a lion, a predator of such immense power that he didn't need to snarl to be feared. He didn't just own a house, he owned a kingdom. And she wasn't just a guest in his home, she was a prize inside a fortress. She had traded the erratic cruelty of a husband for the absolute cold protection of a kingpin. The question that haunted her as she met his gaze was no longer if Arthur would find her, but what would happen to her soul now that she belonged to the dragon. The silence of the estate was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the arrogant screech of tires on gravel. From the security monitors in the den, Naomi watched as a fleet of white SUVs, clean, corporate, and predatory, blocked the main gates. Arthur stepped out of the lead vehicle, adjusting his gold cufflinks as if he were arriving for a gala rather than a confrontation. In his hand he clutched a leather-bound folder, a legal order obtained through the corrupt judges he kept on his payroll. Naomi felt the old cold terror clawing at her throat. "He's here," she whispered, her hands shaking so violently they rattled against the obsidian table. Ji-hoon didn't move from his chair. He remained perfectly still, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his tattooed hand. "Let him in," he said into his lapel mic. His voice was so calm it was unnerving. A man who travels so far for a greeting shouldn't be kept waiting in the sun. The massive front doors swung open, and Arthur marched into the foyer, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble. He looked around the minimalist masterpiece of a home with a sneer of practiced superiority. When his eyes landed on Ji-hoon, his lip curled. He didn't see the dragon. He saw a man he considered beneath him, a hired driver who had overstepped his station. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, boy," Arthur began, his voice booming with the misplaced confidence of the ultra-wealthy. He tossed the leather folder onto the table, splashing a drop of Ji-hoon's drink. "That's a court order for the immediate return of my wife. You've had your fun playing hero, but the adults are speaking now. Pack her up and get her to the car before I decide to buy this entire hillside just to watch it burn." Ji-hoon didn't look at the document. He didn't even look at Arthur. He simply rotated the glass in his hand, watching the ice swirl. Arthur's face reddened. The silence was an insult he wasn't equipped to handle. "Are you deaf, or is the English too fast for you?" Arthur stepped closer, his shadow looming over the sofa. "I've dealt with your kind in the shipping docks. You think a few tattoos and a sharp suit make you a king? You're a footnote, a servant who stole a car, and a girl who doesn't belong to you. Give me Naomi, or I'll have my people turn this glass house into a graveyard." Naomi stood at the edge of the room, her heart stopping as Arthur reached out as if to grab her. But before he could take a step toward her, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-hoon finally looked up. His eyes weren't angry, they were dead. The cold, clinical detachment in his gaze was far more terrifying than Arthur's screaming rage. He set the glass down with a soft clink that felt like a gavel striking. "You speak of ownership as if you have the hands to hold it," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "You come into my home and talk of my kind, but you have forgotten the most basic rule of the world you pretend to rule, Arthur." Ji-hoon stood up, his height surprising Arthur, who took an involuntary step back. The dragon on Ji-hoon's neck seemed to pulse in the low light. "A wolf should never bark at a lion when he is already inside the den. You didn't bring a court order, you brought a suicide note." Arthur let out a sharp, jagged laugh, the sound of a man who believed his bank balance was a physical shield. "A suicide note? You're a driver, you delusional parasite. I own the banks that hold the debt on buildings like this. I own the politicians who allow people like you to exist in the margins." He stepped forward, reaching out to snag Naomi's silk sleeve, his fingers curling like talons. "Naomi, get in the car, now, before I make sure this man never finds work in this hemisphere again." Ji-hoon didn't move to block him physically. He didn't need to. He simply reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a slim, matte black smartphone. He tapped a single contact and held the phone to his ear, his gaze never leaving Arthur's face. "Start the liquidation," Ji-hoon said into the receiver. His voice was conversational, almost bored. "The Sterling Group, every offshore account, every shell company in Panama, and the primary holdings in the London Exchange. Sell it all, now." Arthur froze, his hand hovering inches from Naomi. "What are you talking about? You can't—" "I don't play with court orders, Arthur," Ji-hoon interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "I play with the pulse of the market. Your family's wealth is built on a foundation of my family's silence. We allowed your father to launder his pride through our channels 30 years ago. I simply decided 5 seconds ago that I no longer value your business." Arthur's phone began to vibrate in his pocket, then his head of security's phone, then the tablets in the SUVs outside. A chorus of digital panic began to rise. Arthur pulled out his device, his face draining of color as he watched the red lines on his portfolio app plummet in a vertical drop. In the world of high finance, it was a glitch. In the world of Ji-hoon, it was an execution. "This is impossible," Arthur stammered, his bravado collapsing like a house of cards. You're just a—" "I am the man who allows you to breathe," Ji-hoon said, standing up and smoothing the front of his vest. He didn't look like a driver anymore. He looked like an ancient, vengeful deity. "And I have grown tired of your noise." Ji-hoon made a small, sharp gesture with 2 fingers. From the shadows of the foyer, 4 men in black suits appeared with the suddenness of ghosts. They didn't draw weapons, they simply moved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. They seized Arthur by the arms, lifting him off his feet as if he weighed nothing. "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am?" Arthur screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He kicked and thrashed, but the men were immovable. "You are a man with no money, no wife, and no future," Ji-hoon said, turning his back on the scene. "Take him to the docks. He wanted to talk about my kind. Let him see how we handle those who break our guests." As Arthur was dragged out, his screams fading into the gravel of the driveway, the house returned to its heavy, sterile silence. Naomi stood by the glass wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar empire with a 30-second phone call. Ji-hoon picked up his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "The water is still cold, Naomi. Drink. The trash has been collected." The stillness that followed Arthur's removal was not the fragile, trembling quiet of a victim hiding in the closet. It was the profound, heavy peace of a fortress after the siege has ended. Naomi stood in the center of the foyer, her gaze fixed on the double doors where the man who had tormented her for years had been erased like a smudge on a window pane. She felt lighter, the phantom weight of Arthur's expectations finally dissolving into the sterile air of the estate. "It's over," she whispered, the words tasting like a prayer she had forgotten how to say. Ji-hoon didn't answer with platitudes. He walked toward her, his footsteps rhythmic and grounding on the marble. He stopped just a few feet away, his presence no longer a source of terror, but a shield of absolute stability. "The world he built for you is gone, Naomi. The banks, the names, the threats, they have been returned to the earth." He gestured toward the wide glass doors leading to the balcony. Naomi followed him out into the cool evening air. The city lay before them like a sprawling carpet of diamonds, a million lights flickering in a valley that had once felt like a hunting ground. Now, from this height, it looked like a kingdom. Naomi leaned against the cold stone railing, the midnight blue silk of her robe catching the breeze. Beside her, Ji-hun stood with his sleeves rolled up, the intricate tattoos on his forearms exposed to the moonlight. For the first time, she noticed that the dragon etched into his skin didn't look like a monster meant to devour. It looked like a guardian meant to endure. "I spent so long running," Naomi said, her voice steady as she looked out over the horizon. "I thought safety was just a place where no one could find me. I didn't realize it was a place where no one could touch me." "Safety is a choice," Ji-hun replied, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "Arthur chose to rule through fear. I choose to rule through respect. One is a glass house, the other is a mountain." He turned to her, his expression softening into something that wasn't quite a smile, but a deep, silent vow. He didn't reach for her hand or try to claim her. He simply stood by her side, acknowledging her space. Naomi looked down at her bare ring finger, the skin still slightly pale where Arthur's heavy diamond had once sat. She felt a strange, surging sense of power. She had entered that black sedan as a broken bride, a woman whose life was a series of apologies. She stood on this balcony as something else entirely, a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and found a king waiting there to lift her up. "What happens now?" she asked. Ji-hun looked out over the sprawling lights of the city, his city. "Now we rebuild. You are no longer a guest, Naomi. This is your home, and everything the light touches, from the docks to the high-rises, knows that you are under the shadow of the dragon." Naomi took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs without the sharp sting of fear. She looked at the man beside her, the Mafia boss, the driver, her protector. She realized she had traded a vow of servitude for a vow of sovereignty. As the hints of a new dawn began to bleed into the sky, Naomi didn't look back at the ruined dress or the man she had fled. She looked forward, standing tall beside the lion she had found in the dark, ready to rule the city that was now theirs.